Hello everyone, Ranger William here from the Overmountain Victory National Historic Trail, bringing you another episode of Trail Talk, where we're trying to get to the stories behind the story of the Overmountain Victory National Historic Trail. Now, the months that led up to the fateful march through the mountains, these were filled with numerous skirmishes and clashes between Patriot Militia and elements of Patrick Ferguson's Loyalist Command. Now, these ranged from small scattered shots and ambushes to running battles across the South Carolina upcountry and even some larger picked fights, larger engagements. Now, one of the last clashes before the fateful march was the Battle of Cane Creek. And so to tell us more about that battle, its location, and its impact on our story, we're joined today by Trevor Freeman. Now, Trevor has an undergrad in public history from Appalachian State. He has a master's in American history from Eastern Carolina University. He's actually a former intern in education and interpretation from Cowpens National Battlefield, where our paths first crossed. And Trevor is currently the public programs director for the Western North Carolina Historical Association. Now, he's also author of the article Skulking Shots on the Flank, the Skirmish at Cane Creek, which was published in the Journal of the American Revolution at allthingsliberty.com. So Trevor, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Good to be here. Good to catch up.
So to kind of start out with a little bit of background for people who aren't familiar with the Battle of Cane Creek, when did it take place? And where is Cane Creek? Where is this battle site located today?
Okay, so the battle took place in the mid-morning of September 12, 1780. It's roughly 2 weeks before the Overmountain men assembled. The fight involved local and regional Patriot militias, along with British provincials and loyalists. On the Patriot side, you had a bunch of foothill area partisans, Western North Carolina and South Carolina. The Patriots, they're commanded by Charles McDowell. There was an estimated 220 to 300 men based on different estimates from British officers. This was a lot smaller than the 450 men Charles McDowell had just a few weeks earlier. But he was down to a core of guys that he had been recruiting in the Burke County area. The British, they came into this fight with about 650 old and infirm men, as Patrick Ferguson described them, but not all of them were actually at the skirmish at Cane Creek. In fact, it was about 140 guys, about 40 mounted provincials, Ferguson's American volunteers, and then 100 or so Tory militia. And they're all, of course, under the command of Patrick Ferguson, who we'll discuss with the Battle of Kings Mountain coming up. The battle itself had occurred near the head of Cane Creek, which is roughly near the border of Burke, McDowell, and Rutherford counties. The exact location is still not exactly conclusively known, however.
Now, is there any reason that it's not conclusively known? Any kind of ideas why?
The site is being named Cane Creek. That's obviously a very common name, but it's narrowed down because we know basically the direction Ferguson's moving in. The only accounts left by British officers really say that it took place near the head of Cane Creek. And we have some other identifying information. It took place near a commanding ridge. But again, that's so unspecific and vague, and archaeological investigations haven't really turned up a conclusive pattern of artifacts either. So it's hard to narrow down precisely where this occurred, but we know a general area.
Okay. Now you're talking about Charles McDowell, how he was losing men. The numbers that you were giving is about like half of what his command was previously. And this is taking place, as you're saying, pretty far up into North Carolina. So kind of my question for you is, we go from having Charles McDowell, who previously, like a month before, back in August, he has a camp down in South Carolina, hundreds of men, all these different forces coordinating with him. You've got Isaac Shelby, Elijah Clark, James Williams, all kind of teaming up with Charles McDowell in South Carolina. You've got the victory over Ferguson's forces at Musgrove's Mill on August 19th. Now, fast forward less than a month later, and here's Patrick Ferguson chasing these guys all the way up in North Carolina with a smaller force than what they have. If he's bringing, however many said, about 100 or so loyalist militia and provincials chasing Charles McDowell and his guys. How did we get to this point? Like what has changed that's taken the bite out of the Patriots' bark?
So even though Ferguson and the loyalists and provincials, they're winning key battles like they're losing key battles such as Musgrave's Mill. The backcountry still isn't exactly settled. In fact, Ferguson is going to move into Gilberttown, about 14 miles southeast of Cane Creek, partly out of urgency because he needs a secure location for Tories to get and be trained and basically armed by his provincial forces. He's also moving there because there's a local loyalist, Ambrose Mills, who he's going to resurface again at Kings Mountain. But he had been stirring up Tories in this former Tryon County, now Rutherford County region. And he and Cornwallis had been communicating. He has basically promised Cornwallis that he's going to raise forces to be commanded by James Dunlap. And by all accounts, Mills is being pretty successful in this endeavor. Also, on the Patriot side with Charles McDowell, he's maybe losing the respect of a lot of the men under his command. He's becoming known as a little indecisive, not very active. He's been caught before and surprised in July on the North Carolina-South Carolina border at a place called Earl's Ford. Here in this nighttime battle, there's a Tory attack led by Major James Dunlap, which apparently makes McDowell and a couple of the other Patriot leaders flee. So he's losing respect of some of his men. So again, the backcountry is not exactly settled. McDowell retreats back into Burt County and he's recruiting men there, while Ferguson moves into Gilberttown. And basically Ferguson's better trained and better armed provincial forces, even though they're small, they're playing a key role in his push up into North Carolina.
Okay, so it's a big morale question. When Charles McDowell falls back, he loses public faith, so he loses men because they don't want to serve on the losing side. And then here comes Ferguson kind of in his wake, who appears victorious with trained men, with supplies, with his great proclamations, and men are joining to him. Okay, so that can kind of explain why all of a sudden you've gone from in the driver's seat to now being pursued. Now you talked about how it's about how far northeast or northwest from Gilberttown?
So Cane Creek, according to the diary of Lieutenant Anthony Allaire, is about 14 miles from Gilberttown. That's how we know they marched about 14 miles that morning, 2 o'clock in the morning of September 12th, to get there to the battle site. That also gives us a decent approximation of where the battle itself took place.
Right, like you mentioned, the Loyalist accounts kind of measuring it out so we have an idea, but also they're just saying head of the creek, there's a ridge. And an approximation of this path would be about Highway 64, is that right?
Yes, that's a really good approximation. Of course, at the time, being called Cane Creek, if that's any indication, it's not an easy route to travel. They're going to have to ford the creek about 19 to 20 times, is what some of the British or Loyalist officers report. So this is it's not like driving up modern 64 now. This is a pretty arduous journey just to get there in the morning.
Right, especially like you were saying, it's named Cane Creek, and those who are unaware, river cane, this plant will grow in these dense thickets on creek banks, 10, 15 feet high, just these impenetrable thickets. And if this is covering those creek banks and they're having to cross the creek so many times, not going to be easy traveling. And that kind of brings me to a question I had. Various accounts, in fact, Ferguson's own letters, talk about an unexpected detour that he ended up taking. Now, this detour kind of brought him up because he's pursuing the Patriots, but this brings him up to a position that he wasn't quite expecting to find the Patriots. Like there's a bit of surprise here. Do the Patriots know they're being chased? Was this detour that Ferguson took? Was it on purpose? Did he get lost in the cane? The multiple ridges in that area? Do we know kind of what brought them there? Why wasn't this unexpected detour guarded by the Patriot Militia?
Right. This is kind of a lingering question. We know the Patriots, they know they're being chased. In fact, they're laying in wait. They're setting a trap for Ferguson. They've got plenty of scouts in the area, including a man named Aaron DeVinny, who's captured and not released until Kings Mountain when Ferguson's defeated. But they're reporting back to McDowell and everybody else that the Ferguson's forces are moving out that morning. According to lore, also, they're guarding a pass that's supposed to be impenetrable. And so we also have accounts from the British, from Allaire, I believe, who says that they're kind of surprised, that the British are, by McDowell and Colonel Andrew Hampton suddenly riding up to about 100 yards in front of them, just popping up out of nowhere. So it seems like both sides end up a little bit surprised by each other because of this unexpected detour and because the Patriots are laying in wait. Now, there isn't necessarily a road that's visible today or any kind of road trace, but Kenneth Robinson, the archaeologist who studied this area a few years ago, suggested a few possible routes that could have been this unexpected detour near the head of the creek. About 2 miles from the head of the creek, there's a small pass to your left that goes up into a cove, and this is logically one of the only possible detours they could have taken. Everything else is very hemmed in by pretty steep-sided hills. And it's not really easy to prove that, however.
Right. And but if the terrain's like you're talking about, and we said that Highway 64 is an approximation of kind of the route, but if people just drive through that today and notice how choked and how steep some of those little passes can get, there's really not many other places that roads could go. But you can easily understand why one simple turn to the left side of the ridge instead of the right could wind up with a whole army of men being hidden, and then all of a sudden there they are where you weren't expecting them. Now, talking a little bit more about the battle, there's not many casualties recorded in this fight. We talked about a little over 100 on the Loyalist side, 200 to 300 on the Patriot side. But what casualties do we end up looking at?
So there, again, aren't many casualties. There's 1 killed, 1 wounded on the British side. I think that should be 2 wounded, however, because Major James Dunlap is wounded as well. And then the Patriots have, I think, 2 killed and 17 captured. So it's a very short battle. According to Anthony Allaire, one of the British Loyalist officers, it seems like the Patriots actually meant to put up a fight. However, he said they took a commanding ridge and rode up right to the face of the oncoming British, but apparently they dispersed with just a few shots. And this apparently came after Ferguson ordered his soldiers with bayonets to advance. So in the common pattern, you see militia, they fare pretty well against other militia, but once the bayonets are facing rifles, the militia tend to disperse. Ferguson, I think, interestingly, describes the Patriots' fire as idle. However, there's another Loyalist captain, Alexander Chesney, who calls them very determined. So I think it's interesting, this disparity between the descriptions of the fight the Patriots put up. And I think this could either signal Ferguson's arrogance or hubris towards the local militias. He's defeated them at various points before. It could also signify Chesney's relative inexperience in fights. Ferguson, he's been involved at the Battle of Brandywine and some of these large fights in the north. So this minor skirmish may not seem very determined to him, but with Chesney, maybe he's also sensing this as something bigger than it actually is. either way, though, the trap that the Patriots tried to set dispersed pretty quickly.
Now, talking about the difference in the Patriots' resolve, we said how McDowell is kind of losing his popularity, that kind of cult of personality that usually follows militia leaders. Do you think that could be something for the Patriot resolve? Like, he ordered them to stand and fight, that was the plan. But then when they saw, you know what, the battle's going on, if I remember right in the accounts, all of a sudden Loyalist cavalry are flanking them on one side. These guys are done and they're gone. Even if McDowell's there trying to rally them, they're not going to listen. Could that have been a factor?
Absolutely, and we really don't know anything about McDowell's character during this fight. It said he rode up to the front of the line, but we don't know whether he turned and fled, kind of like he was supposed to have done at Earl's Ford, or if he stayed and tried to rally troops. Either way, we I don't think we know a lot about the demeanor of the men involved in this.
It's like so often we'll say in historical research, just 15 minutes with a time machine and a Polaroid camera, we'll have all our answers.
Yeah.
Now, you talked about the wounded Major James Dunlap.
Yeah.
What can you tell us a little bit more about this guy? Because is this the same officer that we heard you mention at Earl's Ford?
Yes.
Okay, so same officer lineup. Dunlap attacking McDowell at Earl's Ford. Now you've got Dunlap involved in the attack on McDowell at Cane Creek. What do we know about James Dunlap?
Yeah, so he's a very interesting figure. He's a Queen's Ranger, so that's the unit that John Graves Simcoe leads in the north. But he's recruited by Ferguson, who says, come with me. I'm going to be the inspector of the militia in the south. Join the American Volunteers, and Dunlap, maybe sensing the ability to rise through the ranks a little bit, follows Ferguson and has a very active career here in the Southern campaign. He's kind of known for leading brave and bold and daring attacks while outnumbered. And inflicting a good bit of damage while doing so. He led the attack in the middle of the night at Earl's Ford that surprised McDowell and a large camp of militiamen. But unfortunately for the British, he's supposed to lead that group of militia that Colonel Ambrose Mills is raising for him. And he's supposed to lead them in the backcountry, the 96 area of South Carolina. But unfortunately for the British plans, he's wounded at Cane Creek, and he spends the next several weeks recovering at Gilberttown and misses Kings Mountain altogether. He recovered in November, and by this time raising loyalists is a little bit of a challenge, so he ends up in Charleston for the brief period in early 1781. He gets a small force. Cornwallis sends him back into the 96th district, and now he's on a mission to destroy the home, take the slaves, and just wreck the life of Andrew Pickens, the South Carolina militia leader. Eventually, he's wounded in another engagement in South Carolina, and ironically, he's sent back to Gilberttown again to recover. But this time he's murdered by local patriots, possibly an Overmountain man. I want to say by the name of Gibbs. Apparently he's murdered, according to the local lore, in a very brutal way, being shot several times throughout the night as he lay in bed. It's an account that comes from, I think, a New Jersey provincial that's there wounded with him. But he gets a little bit of the same reputation that maybe a Bannister Tarleton or some of these other really hated loyalist officers get.
Man,
so it gets a very unceremonious end.
No kidding. That's quite the character. I mean, all the way you're looking at, because other officers that have kind of served with Ferguson for a while, you do see some really kind of big names. One guy that I really love to talk about is George Hanger, how he was serving under Ferguson for a while before transferring to Tarleton in the British Legion. Now you've got a former Queen's Ranger officer recruited by Ferguson. Like, he's building the A team of loyalist provincials to come down here and clean up shop in the South. So we've talked a lot about, how the battle happened, McDowell's kind of loss of faith with his men. In your opinion, writing the article on this, what do you think is the biggest kind of single impact that this had on the Kings Mountain campaign?
I think Ferguson may have taken an overinflated sense of superiority from this fight. Now, once he disperses these guys, he's free to move on into the Burt County region and then push up further into the mountains, chasing officers, and then also chasing the cattle that the Patriots are collecting there. But I think it gave Ferguson a little bit too much confidence. He towed the line just a little bit too long, waited a little bit too long to try to catch up with Cornwallis, and ended up surrounded at Kings Mountain. I think also it's just his view time and time again of seeing militia break and flee may have influenced his thinking while he's on Kings Mountain. I mean, he doesn't throw up breastworks or anything else to defend himself. He, basically claims he can't be driven off this mountain, or if he does, he'll die there. Essentially.
There you go.
Yeah, he. I think he just takes a little bit too much confidence out of this.
Well, so that actually kind of brings us to a little bonus question I had for you. Following the story about the aftermath of Cane Creek, we see Charles McDowell and his men flee over the mountains, take shelter in the Watauga settlements with Isaac Shelby. But let's flip that. So if Isaac Shelby and his Wataugans, if they had not fled all the way back over the mountains, if they had stayed with McDowell, stayed with his Burt County guys, helped kind of cover them for a while longer, if Shelby and his men had been there with McDowell, with his militia at the head of Cane Creek, and if they had actually either not killed Ferguson, but just pushed back and defeated this thrust that he makes up Cane Creek, how do you think this would have changed the story of the campaign?
I think, and I really like this question, I think the answer probably lies in recruiting for both sides. If, in whatever way the Patriots had repulsed Ferguson, the British recruiting efforts would not have been as successful. Lieutenant Allaire said that after the skirmish at Cane Creek, the people of the province, I think he called them deluded, became wise kind of to their rebellion or to their foolishness and not aligning with the crown, and they began flocking in. So while Ferguson gets this huge group of people that he doesn't necessarily even have the arms and accoutrements to truly make use of, if he never had them at all, conceivably, I think he would have felt less secure in his base there at Gilbertown, may have even pushed on back to try to reunite with Cornwallis. Again, also with his later movements into the mountains, chasing leaders and chasing cattle, I don't know that he would have had the same reign to do that if he had been checked at Cane Creek. And then also for the Patriot side, I mean, and a victory may have bolstered McDowell's status just a little bit with his men again, but also then again, we may have never even had the Overmountain men in the march to Kings Mountain were it not for this. It may or may not have impacted their recruiting efforts as well. But again, that's a little bit of speculation. Either way, I think it definitely had an effect on Ferguson's planning and his attitudes afterwards.
I want to touch on what you just said there. That's a great point. A real big example of that lose the battle, win the war thing. So if Cane Creek had been a Patriot victory, you don't have the panic, you don't have the urgency, you don't have McDowell and his men fleeing over to Watauga. You don't have Shelby feeling the need to maybe rally Sevier and Campbell and get them together. Because if I'm not mistaken, it's Shelby's appeals to Campbell. He makes a big point of saying how McDowell has fled, how the people are refugees. They need to go and save them and help them. That's one of the big things that gets Campbell on board.
Yes.
So because it's a British victory, because Campbell loses, I'm getting them all mixed up here. Because it's a British victory and McDowell loses his face and they have to flee, that maybe was the push needed to make the Great Gathering happen.
Yeah, and even further, I think whether or not it was at the encampment the day before or the day after passing King Creek, basically on the Overmountain March, I think Campbell was selected out of all the colonels as the leader of the expedition, basically near the side of King Creek. They come through where, McDowell's just been driven off, and that's where they make this decision that he's too old, he's too inactive, he's not an energetic enough leader to command this large Overmountain March to get Ferguson. So instead he is sent to ride to Hillsborough to request a commander.
And that's Shelby's call, right? Where he thinks McDowell isn't up to it?
Yes, I think so.
Man. So, not only are we looking at a campaign tie-in of, oh, there was a battle, so they lost guys, so they did blah, 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 but we're getting really deep here into the faith that these men have in their officers. Again, being militia, being frontiersmen, it's a big personality thing. It's a big charisma thing. And tying in with the whole thing of, if they had won the battle, maybe they don't feel urgent enough to go after Ferguson. So this has been fantastic. I want to thank you for taking the time to talk with us. For those who didn't catch the introduction, this has been Trevor Freeman talking about this, author of the article Skulking Shots on the Flank, the Skirmish at Cane Creek, all about this engagement leading up to the Battle of Kings Mountain. So Trevor, one last thing. If anyone wants to kind of learn more about this, dig in a little bit, is there any other recommended sources besides your article that you'd recommend people check out?
Yeah, absolutely. Go to the primary sources on this because there are very few secondary sources at all that even touch it. But the diary of Lieutenant Anthony Allaire, the diary of Alexander Chesney, a few scattered pension applications. Aaron DeVinny talks a little bit about this. And of course, Ferguson and Cornwallis is on correspondence. They all touch on the skirmish here.
Fantastic. So thanks again, Trevor. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in and catching this. This has been Trail Talk, where we're diving into the stories behind the story of the Overmountain Victory National Historic Trail. So thank you for tuning in.